In the election of 1934, FDR gets a Congress that's dominated by the Democratic Party. And he is going to reorient himself to the point that we have to talk about a second New Deal. He goes in the direction of wanting to do more. So let's talk about a few examples of that. One of which is going to be the WPA, the Work Progress Administration. It's work relief, all right, but on a massive scale. The WPA lasted a long time, from 1935 to 1941, and it averaged about 2 million people. Now, the fundamental area here is that if private enterprise cannot give a reasonable number of American people something to do, the government will. If they if they have to just make it up. Now, the WPA is going to start out by making sidewalks. I got my doctorate from the University of North Texas, and if you walk around Wooten Hall, where the history department is located, you can actually see cracks in the cement. But in the cement is the actual seal of the Work Progress Administration. And if you've been to the Riverwalk, I am a native of San Antonio, and the Riverwalk is actually a WPA project. High school stadiums and high schools were also built as a result of the WPA. They did things of lasting value, but not nearly as big as some of the larger projects that we've discussed. The WPA had also had the novel notion that unemployed teachers and musicians needed to eat. So they had federal musician projects. They hired teachers to go and write travel guides. One of the projects they did with teachers was they went and they found out the last remaining slaves. We're talking about former slaves that were children when emancipation happens, right? And they all collect these stories, and we have vast narratives of what it was like to be a slave in the voice of the slaves themselves. For younger people, there was a thing called the National Youth Administration. It tried to keep people in school. It paid young people to work as tutors, lab assistants, anything they could do in order to stay at school. Now, do you know who ran the Texas chapter of the NYA? It's a young man named Lyndon B. Johnson. You might have heard of him before. He was the director of the Texas NYA. And something interesting here. During this time period, we have a racially segregated South. However, Johnson refused to actually racially segregate his own chapter. He racially integrated it. So even 30 years before he's president of the United States, he's different. But we'll talk more about that later. Now you might be wondering, where's all the money coming from? And that's a good question. This is important to understand. There were taxes, however low they were due to the Depression, but there was something else. How do you finance something that you cannot afford? You borrow, right? If you have a house, if you got a car and you can't afford paying it outright, you borrow it, right? So don't get too upset about this. In 1939, the U.S. national debt was $40 billion. By 1980, it's under $1 trillion, and now it's like, what, 21 trillion, right? Now, back then, was it necessary to run up the debt? Probably. In case you think we were spending a lot of money on people, let me give you another set of numbers. The national budget in 1939 was $9 billion. By 1945, that budget was $98 billion. Now, why were we spending $98 billion in 1945? Oh, World War II, right? Now, I want you to think about it like this. It has always been common to say that the New Deal did not get us out of the Great Depression. It was the war. And in a certain sense, this is true. But think about this also. What was it about the war that got us out of the Depression? How was killing Germans and Japanese and sending troops over the seas going to get us out of the Depression? It's the spending of the money for the war. It's not the war itself. It's the spending of that money. So just suppose we were willing to spend that kind of money to fight the Depression. Could we have spent our way out of it? I don't know. Maybe. Who knows? The next thing that FDR did in the way of doing more, way more, is the Social Security Act of 1935. FDR said this is probably the most important act he ever made. The Social Security Act does a couple of things, and basically what it does is it creates a system of old age payments. Don't say insurance. It's not. It's payments. Social Security means that you work and you pay those who have retired. And basically what happens is those retired who have paid in the system before you get the benefits. It's a transfer of wealth payment system. It's controversial then and it's controversial now. And some people say it's going broke. I'll leave it to the economic majors to figure that one out. But I think one of the problems is this. What is the money paid into in terms of Social Security used to buy? By law, it's automatically invested in U.S. securities. So all of that Social Security money is actually invested in the trillions of dollars of debt we had. So if Social Security ever goes broke, it's not going to be because the idea of Social Security was bad, only because it actually we could not pay back our debts. This is a welfare state measure. The government gets into the job of taking care of the elderly. Is it socialist? No. Does it change the way people own in this country? No. Does it change private enterprise? Not at all. It doesn't change the system fundamentally at all. It's not a socialist measure. It's a welfare state measure. Another measure that was passed was the National Labor Relations Act of 1935. This is the single most pro-labor union measure in the United States to this day. What it did was it allowed the federal government protection to workers who wanted to form a union and bargain collectively. Think about it. What happened when you wanted to form a union, say, in the 1930s? Go and try to form a union one of Henry Ford's operations and see what happens. First, you're going to be fired, and then if you picket, Ford's goons are going to come out and beat the heck out of you with axe handles. You think I'm exaggerating? Try unionizing the steel industry or the auto industry back then was dangerous. So this is a little bit of the government doing more. Another example of the government doing more was the Rural Electrification Administration. It's set up by the government in order to provide electricity to people living out in the sticks. Because honestly, if they were going to wait for private enterprise to do it, they'd probably still wait then. What they would do is it would basically give people loans to people that wanted to create a electric co-op to provide electricity for their area. It's still in operation in some locations. Go to Munster in Cook County. Go down to Hamilton in Hamilton County, and you'll see electric co-op billboards everywhere. The point is the following. What did private enterprise have to do to stay in business? They have to make money, right? Now, if you're running a small co-op and you're spending money to put up poles and string power lines, can you afford to be able to do this for the few farms that are scattered out in the middle of nowhere, who will probably be lucky if you pay about $3.25 a month? Of course not. If you are waiting for private enterprise, as I said, you'd probably be still waiting for it today. But in terms of paying for all of this, of course, there's going to be a Revenue Act of 1935. And on paper, it really taxes the wealthy. On paper, if you had a $5 million annual income, you paid 75% in taxes. Now, you might cringe at the thought, but when you consider the time period we're talking about, hard times. So if you had this set up, what you would basically have a little bit, some money to squeeze out on, all right? If you got $5 million and you're going to take 75% of it, you're going to have to go buy, make do with $1 million. I think I can do it. But if you cut out the beer and the cigarettes, you might just make it. But don't feel sorry about these people because they had really good tax attorneys who would find every single tax loophole they could find. Now, talking about the New Deal, what I've tried to do is talk about all the things that have been done right away in 1933, and a lot have been done on an emergency basis. In 1934, the New Deal starts to run into opposition from people that are thinking that they're doing too little and those that are thinking it's doing too much. How did FDR reorient himself in 1935? Well, he went on and did more, right? But we now have reached the point where FDR's first term is done, and now he has to stand for re-election. And in 1936, FDR is going to be re-nominated by the Democrats. And he promised to do more, particularly in the lines of the second New Deal. The Republicans were kind of up against it. Do you think they would have had a lot of luck if they ran absolutely against the New Deal and said, choose us and we'll stop the relief? Choose us and we're going to go back to the old days of 1932? Probably not going to work. And they could see that. So what they did is they tried to run on a lot of the same things that the New Deal was doing. But they would do it with less government bothering people somehow, less expensive money, less dictatorial government. The Republicans nominated a man named Alfred Landon of Kansas. They essentially ran on the same campaign, saying, we'll do the same thing that FDR is doing, but we're going to do it better. Less government, less expensive. FDR went about campaigning not so much against Landon, but on the merits of the New Deal. He did not have to campaign as a Democrat, but he could actually just campaign as the President of the United States, the president who had been bringing all of the things. The payoff is tremendous. All right, it's a landslide. When you look at it, it's a bunch of blue states, right? You're going to get depressed just looking at it because you're going to feel blue, right? There's only two red states, Maine and Vermont. The electoral vote, 523 to 8. That's a pretty convincing mandate. Now, back then, there was a saying, as Maine goes, so does the country. But after this election, it had to be changed. As Maine goes, so does Vermont. So even though the country was not quite coming out of the Depression, Roosevelt is having huge payoffs in his New Deal policies. Now, FDR began his second term in 1937. And as a side note, when we had an election inauguration day, it had been held up all the way into 1933 is March 4th. The election was in November. Inauguration wasn't until March, which created a period what's known as the lame duck, right? Now, what happened during the period between Roosevelt's first election and when he finally took office in March of 33, the Depression got worse. Well, after realizing that things don't move, they don't move as slowly as they used to, they're moving a lot faster, we're going to have a change in the inauguration day. And the Constitution will be amended, and inauguration day will be moved to January 20th, where it remains to this day. Which makes a lot of sense considering how quickly things go about today's lives.